In this edition of the Writer's Gym podcast, we'll be talking about relationships in your fiction. Whether your characters are falling in love or starting to hate each other, the interactions between them will often form the basis of your plot, so making these relationships convincing and interesting is going to be critical to your storytelling. Welcome to the Writer's Gym. The Writer's Gym podcast. Build creative confidence and grow your writing life. With Rachel Knightley and Emily Inpen. Rachel Knightley and Emily Inpen, hello.
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 Now, I'd argue that relationships of all kinds and all flavours are the bedrock of your stories and plots. Could you each say a little bit about the importance of relationships, please?
Emily brought up on the last series submitting the novel and all of the plot, lovely explosive things happening, but then the agent saying about taking it back a bit and making us care about the characters first. And I think that's sort of been the perfect example for me, because I'm very, very character driven and I'm fascinated by people. I mean, this is not surprising coming from a coach. I am interested in why people do the things that they do and what we want and what we fear and all of that. And I'm fascinated by that. And you need to care about them. So for me, this is the playground bit, is where you go into the arguments and where you go into the working together, whether they like each other or not, when you go into the like each other very much and then something else happening in the outside world and the relationship between character and plot. I mean, that is where the fun stuff is.
Yes. So I am also a very character-driven writer. Characters and what happens to them, what happens in the world is only interesting in as much as it affects the character and how it affects the characters and how it drives what the characters do next. And I think that is so important to remember and to understand. Your characters themselves are the core of the story, and everything that happens to them is what happens to them. They are not happening to the events.
Yeah.
The events are happening to them. And as soon as you get that into your head, like some people who are plot driven as opposed to character driven, will think of the events first and then see a character as a vessel through which to see the events. And it's like, that's not how we experience the world. We experience the world in terms of how these things affect us. That is essential, I think, when approaching a novel.
So how can writers use relationships to tell readers more about important characters in their stories? I mean, is it all about the way that they react in situations that we as readers would feel familiar with?
There was a lovely introduction to a character in a Nick Hornby novel, and of course I don't remember which one, because that would be far too useful, where somebody who was recently divorced and dealing with it pretty well and life was moving on and it was going to be all right, was then physically touched in a completely non-emotional way. I think it was measuring for clothes, and burst into tears. And that moment, that character realised something about themselves that they hadn't, and we realised something about the character that they hadn't. And it is about exploring and showing who we are. This is why show don't tell is the ruler, because we can all say, now, you know me, and then insert idealised or hopeful view of ourselves. But that behaviour conveys a truth, as in how does this person operate in the world. So there's doing that. But I think probably the way that I find most fun is what does the character get wrong? What is the character wrong about? What do they not know about themselves? What do they misunderstand about other people? I feel like that's where the fun is.
Yeah.
To quote Ian.
I have this thing about characters the peripheral characters. So I mean, like, something can happen to one of the characters, but then the effects of that thing can have ripple effects that affect all of the other characters as well, especially if it's a traumatic event. One character will experience the trauma, but everybody will probably feel an effect of that trauma, even if the character who goes through it is trying to keep it on the down low.
They're still the epicenter.
They are still the epicenter, and people will notice that they are more tense, will notice that things have changed, will notice things about them. And that is essential, that their trauma is felt by others. If the others aren't paying attention, I mean, for whatever reason, that can be the case. But you have to be really conscious about that, because if another character isn't aware that this first character has gone through something traumatic, that reflects poorly on the one that is completely unaware of it. Because we know often when somebody's experienced something, even if we're not admitting to ourselves that is the case. And on another note, like this is a sort of different note on how this can manifest, I've sometimes had two characters talking about a third character and having completely different opinions on who that third character is and what motivates them and what drives them. And the fun thing is making sure that both of those characters have a point and have a valid sort of interpretation that they're bringing to the table, to the point that you're then like, oh, well, maybe they are that. Maybe they're the other thing. Who is this person, depending on what your perspective is? Yeah,
that's so much fun. If you have two or in Leanne Moriarty's case, 9 third-person limited narrators, and you get to see those characters from each other's point of view, and then you get that brilliant example of how actually everybody feels like everyone else is a proper adult and they're just pretending, as I keep going back to, that they all see each other as a real something or other, or they all see each other as slightly more sorted, and where we know that one character is just massively scared in a certain situation, the person looking at them will just think they're being too cool for school, I love that, because that is so human, the way that we look at each other and don't attribute our own insecurities to other people necessarily.
I've got this thing where I've got, I'll mention names from the Dex universe now, but I mean, it's just to illustrate the different people. So Ren is a very specific type of person. Now, what I like to do is put them into different configurations. So Ren, when Isra is around, is a very different person to when he's alone with Varian, his brother. And when he's alone with Varian, he is such a dick. Like, he is so, like, you kind of just want to punch him in the face. As soon as Isra's around, she dilutes him and she is able to soften him, and he has less of an impact. But when he's alone with Varian, it's like, where did this come from? You are being such a... And if I didn't give him those moments of being alone with his brother, you wouldn't see that side of him. You wouldn't see that sometimes he can be an arse. You would just see him being a reasonably, like the version of him when he's around other people, which is a lot more palatable and a lot easier to get on with. And, but there's something antagonistic that happens between him and Varian, and, whether or not it's because he's relaxed with Varian, he's just able to be a dick because they're brothers and like whatever. But there is something about that dynamic that is different. And I really enjoy being able to explore that, because he's still very much him, but it's just him with a different angle attached.
And that's a truth that people are sometimes so reluctant to explore, that when you go back to your family, the regression, suddenly the teenager or child version of you that normally you've grown out of is alive and well and living in the next conversation you have in the kitchen. And the
triggers all there.
The triggers all there, and they're all the same. And it's such a shame when people feel that they need to be too polite in what they fictionalise, because actually we are all human. We are all a mountain of humour and observation, and you only get to enjoy that when you can laugh at yourself, cry with yourself, notice how those relationships happen, because we've all got them, and it's not about presenting them beautifully and like everything is all shiny and nice. It's about mining it for the stuff that will make readers go, oh, thank God it's not just me.
Yeah. And it's one of those things, I think, that perhaps an inexperienced writer would try to impose too much consistency on the way a single character behaves. And actually we're not like that, because we behave very differently with different people.
And
different circumstances,
different triggers of other kinds too.
And so for a character to be truly have depth and have nuance and to be convincing, they do need to change a bit, don't they?
Yeah, they need to change their presentation. They need to let their guard down. There are times when they are just undiluted versions of themselves, and there are times when they are diluted, or when people are performative. Because when people go into certain situations, like say a professional situation or like a situation where they're under like pressure or whatever, they can be completely different to how they are when they're at home or whatever. I had a friend who has mum mode and work mode, and you see mum mode when her kid comes home, and you know, like you're on a Zoom call and you know, her kid comes home and suddenly she's mum, and then she'll turn back to the camera and she'll be work mode, and it's like two very different people.
I had that with the Zoom conversation where it was a quite heavily involved psychotherapeutic conversation about it was a work conversation, and I can't remember the exact words that the lady was using in conversation, but she was explaining this in very, very depth, and then she goes, yes, it is yellow, it's a ball, yes, and then straight back into the conversation, and there was no change in terms of how sincere and how herself she was. And I love seeing things like that, because she is, you know, the mum bit is absolutely real, and the career bit is absolutely real, and going between them on the head of a pin is also completely real. It's lovely to see. There are so many true versions of each of us.
And it's relationships that make us behave and act differently, isn't it? And in our fiction, our characters will have been shaped by relationships, both as part of the story, the ones that we as readers actually get to witness, but also prior to the story. The way we are as people is often formed by the relationships that we've been part of. So how much of those, what we might call off-camera relationships, do you as a writer need to know about and share with your readers to explain why characters are the way they are?
You're not going to know that until you go in and you write them and you get curious. And I've had a character that I thought that I knew, and then I put them in a new situation that I hadn't previously thought of, and the rest of them becomes clearer to me as a result. It's a lovely freshening up exercise as well. I think that when you've known a character for a long time and maybe you are feeling a bit staid with it, putting them in a situation that maybe doesn't occur in the world of the story at all, but actually does something for you, you do get that extra texture to it, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. One of my things that I say about character development, if you are in the process of developing a character and you don't know them very well yet, and that is a sort of a thing when you're in the early stages of writing, you've got this new character, you don't necessarily know them very well. I mean, you can get to know them through the course of writing the novel, but it's not like to start the novel, you got to know kind of something about who they are. The best thing to do is take that character and put them in a situation. Choose a situation. How would that character be? Explore that situation through their eyes. And in these moments, like putting them in that situation, you get to know the nuance of who they are. And seeing intimate moments is important. I mean, okay, so I've got one character that I'm working on at the moment who never really has an off moment, because the way he's been raised and the way he's lived his life and everything, he's surrounded by people all the time who he doesn't feel at ease with. And he's never had that relationship where he can just relax and be himself. And that in itself is a sort of exercise. He doesn't have that off. And it makes him a very specific type of person. I mean, it makes him tired, if nothing else. And it makes him very insular, because that's what means that he can even survive, you know, like he's the only person he can be himself with is himself. And I kind of... And
potentially not even then, because when people are only in front of the audience, being alone can sometimes be something they find very hard as well, because there isn't anyone to perform it to.
So that process you've described there, Emily, that you can almost say road testing a character, putting them into interactions with other people, into relationships. Is that always something that's going to appear in the story that gets published? Or do you do that as a kind of side exercise just to learn more about that character?
As a side quest, most of the time. Sometimes they do. If I'm writing about a situation that I know comes up later, sometimes it will end up in the story. and I'll put it in the main
But that's
document.
not the intention of the process.
No. Like one of the examples I use is sort of, you've got a character and they need to cross a bridge. And this bridge is rickety, it's old, they don't know if it's going to support their weight. It's quite a high stress situation. How do they react? How do they do this? Do they care? Are they nervous? Are they holding on? Are they going one step at a time and listening very hard with every step? Are they running for it and just thinking the less time I spend on this bridge, the better, and I'm just going to get over it? What are they doing and why? Why are they even crossing this bridge? What in their life is making them cross the bridge? And just putting them in that situation. There may be no bridges in your story. There may be absolutely zero bridges. There may be absolutely zero ravines. But if you put this character in front of a rickety bridge and for whatever reason they had to get to the other side, what would they be like in that situation? And that is a great one because you learn things about the character. Are they afraid of heights? And if they are, why? And that can go into the story as they might never come across heights, but the why they're afraid of heights might, and how that has impacted them and how that might have ripple effects on how they are in other situations. So it's the why as well. It's the who they are in that situation and why, and often the whys will come in.
So you're both script writers as well as novelists and short story writers. Rachel, I want to come to you first on this one. Do relationships tend to manifest themselves differently in dialogue or in scripts than they do in pages of prose, do you think?
Yeah, I want to name and acknowledge that as you ask that, all of my imposter syndrome has just had a party, because the most unhelpful feedback I ever got, and I talked about this in series 1, was I thought I was going for a conversation about in a script. I know there are ideas in here. I get that I'm being too cowardly about bringing them out. Please, will you help me? And what I got was this isn't ready for 27 reasons. I knew it wasn't ready. It never even crossed my mind that it was ready. And it was different conversations, and it was something that I learned a lot about communication involving feedback. But I'm sitting here hearing you call me a scriptwriter, and all I can hear is that person yelling at me in my head. Not that he yelled, but,
The effect was
the effect is ricocheting several years down the line. So I do think that is relevant simply because, in a way, it reminds me that there isn't a difference in that what I'm doing in novels, I'm writing my first novel at the moment, what I did in my short story collections, what I even do in non-fiction articles is emotional truth, is work out what is going on for those people. In script writing, you're not God of the universe in quite that exclusive way where you're jumping into the head of who you choose. It is show. It is action and dialogue. Everyone who's ever gone to my dialogue workshops or read my stuff has gone, oh, you must really love script writing. And for whatever reason, it hasn't come as naturally to me as novel writing. Maybe that's a control freak thing. I don't know. I get to do all of it. But yes, you are still showing the conflicts, the tensions. You're showing what happens in the world. So all I will say with confidence is I think script writing is brilliant training for prose writers and poets, because what you're saying is, how is the world? It's happening there. And you're not, unless you're Brian Friel, giving a whole page of stage... Brilliant, I love Brian Friel, but giving a whole page of stage directions before anything happens. You do have to let go a bit. But at the same time, if that's how you think, it's just an immediate version of exactly the same thing.
Emily, I mean, you've written a lot of scripts.
I have, yeah.
You've had characters and relationships develop over multiple episodes in series.
Yeah.
But you've also written novels as well.
Yeah, see, I'm a similar position to Rachel, weirdly. So because the novels came first, and I have had trouble describing myself as a scriptwriter because I always saw myself as a novelist first. Now I've written 2 seasons of an audio drama. I've worked with people on other scripts. I'm starting to see myself as a scriptwriter as well. Now, when it comes to how characters develop, actually, weirdly, for me, it translates very simply, because key moments of character development happen in conversations. for me in the books as well. It's all through key conversations that pivot moments for those characters, and the relationships between characters. And of course, a lot of drama is dialogue, and so it does allow me to do, it's basically quite a simple translation for me. And where you've got in novels the sort of in the head through their eyes thing, it's amazing what actors can do with tone of voice.
Yeah.
And for me, giving just a simple stage direction for the actor, a simple emotional cue for the actor in the script, they get across in that line what 3 sentences of context will give, or a sentence of context will give, just through their tone of voice. So I think that for me, it's pretty straightforward. It always has felt pretty straightforward. And going back into then writing prose, I sort of settle into it because I've written 500,000 words of this trilogy, and I'm kind of with them. That's where I came from first. But it surprised me when I went into script writing, and I script write for audio, not for visual, and that in itself is a bit of a challenge because you do have to adapt the dialogue, thinking the audience can't see this. But then you got to ask yourself, well, does it matter that the audience can't see this? Because what you have is you have footsteps, you have an echo in a room that you wouldn't have if you were in a different type of room. You have sound effects if you're in a lab, or if you're in a hospital, there's the boop, boop, boop in the background of like monitors and things. You can build up that picture through sound design. Chris. Yeah, you can do that.
The royal we.
Yes, and I can give some basic sort of ideas of where we are, and you take that and you make magic, and that is all the description you need in audio for me.
Yeah.
And it's been the same for stage, because I had something on as part of a festival in a theatre earlier this year, and I did really enjoy that stepping back. I love seeing what the writing has in it and allowing the director to do the rest, and there's something just so rewarding about that. And now I'm doing audio drama, and I am seeing that the psychology is absolutely the same, that when you're coming to it from a perspective of relationships, that's what you're doing. We are all negotiating the world, and we need to make mistakes as we go. And we need to, if we are the hero of the story, not go, right, I'm not playing, the end. We evolve, we work out what about ourselves and what about the world didn't fit, and we decide what we're going to do about that, and we move on. And that is through relationships. Conflict is manifested in how people react to other people.
So I want to think about fiction where relationships are the key driving forces in the plot of that piece of fiction. And now I think you could very well argue that applies to all, if not most, fiction. But I'm thinking of things like romance, where a relationship between two individuals, and possibly a few side individuals along the way, because you've got to have a down before you can have an up. You've got to have a character up. So I suppose the very convoluted question is,
depending on your preferences,
can and how would you maintain the interest in that relationship through an entire book or story or drama or whatever?
So Imposter syndrome wants to run into that sentence by beginning I cheated in my short story cycle, which I clearly didn't. In Twisted Branches, the first of the short stories in that is a letter from the matriarch of the family, who we very quickly realise isn't just doing a random little recipe for her sons. It's a suicide note. You get that within a couple of pages, but it begins as a recipe, and it's her talking to her family, and it's little observations about the house, and it's getting in there. But then we don't spend time in her head for a while. We meet her at different ages. We don't work out who's who at first. It's deliberately, it is a jigsaw. It's working out as we go where in the 5 generations we are through these short stories. But what I was doing in that is wanting to see the relationships from the different angles, that as an individual, of course, we think what we're doing is kind of neutral. You know, we are moving neutrally through these crazy other people in the world, but actually, you know, we're all bouncing off each other. We're all seeing our own history superimposed over everybody we talk to. And starting in her private world where she's not got any kind of reason to lie anymore, it's more that she's still saying, and here's another thing I was right about right up until the end, but you get to see who she cared about. You get clues about her, and then you take that with you as you learn the worst about her from other people's angles. And I found that really fascinating to do, that it is a jigsaw of how there's a self that only we ever know about ourselves, and then there's one for every single person that we're close to, and then one that only the world sees, and the ones that everybody except ourselves sees. And that, I love the fact that it is a jigsaw.
For me, I think that actually seeing the worst of a person. So, okay, one of my favourite things to do when I'm writing characters is to have them have a blazing row at some point. I do love an argument. They are so much fun to write. And I feel like there are pivotal moments in a story. You know, a narrative can turn on a pin after a blazing row. A character can change after a row, after an argument, a solid argument. And a relationship can click after an argument in a way that it wasn't before.
Or fracture completely. And this is the thing. If you're doing character-driven narrative, an argument can change everything. Like it can in our lives. Like if you're having too many arguments, things can change. If you have just one enormous argument, things can change. And I love that. And honestly, I've said this before, like I beg of you, if you are writing relationships between people, I mean, I would say especially romantic relationships, but any relationships, and people are in a stressful situation, please have them disagree at some point, because that's what people do. Everyone has a different idea of how something should go, and everyone has a different level to which they can cope before they lose it. And everybody then, you know, if you've got one person who feels like they're taking the strain and others aren't, they're gonna pop at some point. And please, for the love of God, have them argue, because people do that. There is nothing more boring and dull than reading a situation that is quite high level, so that the situation itself can be very engaging. But if the characters just always get on and always agree and always understand each other magically in the middle of this situation, oh yes, we'll, you know, follow this character because their ideas are always right. Oh, come on, who do you know who thinks like that? No, there is an argument to be had and there is conflict. If somebody is behaving in a way that is putting other people in danger, have one of the people say, what the fuck? You know, it would take very little time for me to start a conflict with somebody who was putting my life in danger or the lives of people I care about in danger. And if I thought that they hadn't done the risk assessment properly and were missing some fundamental points, I would make those points known, because funnily enough, lives are at stake. So there are so many ways in which you can introduce conflict between characters, and it must be there. It can't not be there.
And it is knowing the stakes, isn't it? Because when you know somebody very well, as you will with your characters, getting to know what is at stake for them, not just what we know about what is at stake at the world, but what is it in their background, in their ego, in what's going on for them, that means they feel they have to react in a certain way at a certain time. Or not.
What is their breaking point? What is the thing that is crossing the line? Where is the line? And when has someone just stepped over it and ignored it completely? And that's it. They can't take any more without. That's not okay for them. People can forgive an awful lot to a point. And, you know, like, at what point is it a point too far? And then in the argument, undoubtedly, they will bring up all of the times they almost crossed the line.
And actually, you could learn something there that you haven't heard directly.
Patterns become
that
relevant.
They are serial behaviour in this way.
Exactly,
I have to say, I'd never imagined you being So health and safety and risk assessment based in your writing or in your character development.
Based in my writing, character development and wider life.
So I think we've learned something in the character arc of the character we call Emily Inkpen in
absolutely.
In this conversation.
Risk assessments are very important. You know, like you walk around and you've got things you can trip on. I mean, it's
like health and safety gone mad.
Yeah, part of my you know, like my spouse will just leave shoes in the middle of the room, and I walk into the room and I think, why didn't you leave these by the side of the room? For goodness sake. And this happens.
We are actually recording at Emily's house, and so we can ask Emily's spouse directly whether this is true and whether they do indeed.
No. It's right. It's just because they just do not, you know, like they don't think about it. And they'll just step out of their shoes and walk off. And I call them Emily traps. They've set an Emily trap, and I will then trip over the shoes, and they will say, well, you should have been looking where you're going. And that is grossly unfair, in my opinion. They've set an Emily trap. Emily fell over them. So, yeah, that's the thing. My life is a risk assessment, I think.
And this is why you apply it to your characters.
Absolutely, yes.
So, Rachel, are relationships in fiction most effective, relevant to readers when we can identify with them?
So my honest feelings on that are, if anybody is being irrational at any time, it's not because of irrationality. It's because of emotional depth and history. So even if we don't identify with the specifics that the character is experiencing, don't tell me you don't identify with that. What the person standing next to them would call an overreaction, of what the history is of that. And I think it is therapeutic for most of us to go to fiction to realise that actually that's going on everywhere. It's another reason that I will happily claim that writers make better friends than not writers, because we know everyone is as real as we are. Everybody's got as much of a backstory. Everybody has come to the things that they mess up through possibly good intentions. Understand the story, understand the person. And if you are somebody who is interested in stories, which as writers we're probably gonna be, then everything is relevant at some level. Yes, you then edit what goes in, but everything is interesting, everything is relevant. And I like knowing that.
And Emily, you some fairly high level and quite extreme stuff goes on in your world.
I think it's fair to say yes.
I was going to say, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
But do you anchor those events, those arguments, those relationships in things that you've observed in the real world? I
mean, all relationships are real, and I would say that just like building characters, you take experiences, all life experiences, you blend them up, you spit something original out. Eventually, like, there's always something identifiable in there. For instance, I've mentioned that Ren can be an utter arse most of the time. This is because he's incredibly intelligent and arrogant about it. And so a lot of the time, the conflict that comes up with him is, I told you so. And this can be applied to global scale situations as well as personal situations. He will walk into a room with I told you this was going to happen, and now people are dead, and the political situation has changed, and it's all your own fault because I presented this problem to you 2 weeks ago and you ignored me.
And you can take that right back to, I told you that hummus and chocolate sauce wouldn't make a good sandwich filling.
Exactly. Yes, you can do.
Stakes are slightly higher in your.
This is the thing. It's like different people at different echelons. They have the same motivations. They have the same reactions to things. They're just extrapolating it to the extreme. But the reactions are still quite small and still quite personal. And I always say that the Dex Legacy, for instance, is a family at the end of the day. A lot of what happens in the Dex Legacy happens in a library while drinking tea. And it's all very small, but the stakes are global. But the reactions between the people who are technically in charge of what happens globally are happening in this library while drinking tea and having conversations between a very small cast of characters. And I think that sort of gets to the essence of it. Like, yes, there's results can be big, but the conversations are still small.
Well, hold the thought about families, because I'm going to come to you in a moment, Rachel, because the famous cliche, you can choose your friends, you can't choose your families. In literature, family relationships have been very important to a lot of books and novelists, and I'm a big fan of the work of Jonathan Franzen, and no one writes a dysfunctional family like Jonathan Franzen. And you've had families
Gerard Woodward
and Emily Inkpen, actually, but
just throwing in some excellent dysfunctional families. All of Gerard Woodward's stuff absolutely brilliantly gets. Yeah. What was the question?
Well, I suppose the question is, first of all, what is it about family relationships that make them so effective and such a common source of inspiration in books?
Maybe it's that we feel they are inescapable, that there are certain things about us. So, for example, in my very late 20s, I moved home for a while to save for a mortgage. And my mother and I had a really good conversation about how we were both adults, we were going to be sharing the space and communicating. On day one, she wanted me to roll up the packet that my muesli was in, put a rubber band around it, and then put it sideways in the cupboard in order to store it. Now, I have dyspraxia.
Seems entirely reasonable to me.
Entirely reasonable, absolutely. And I have dyspraxia, so doing organisationally things every day, it just takes a little more software than not in terms of the coordination of all of those things. And I was going to use that every morning. The first thing I said was, for something that I'm going to use every morning, that doesn't feel... And then she told me why it was a very good idea. And then I said, okay, this is day one of me living here. And I made it into a joke, and she laughed and realised that was a thing, and that I wasn't going to have to do what I suggested, which was keep my muesli in my bedroom and just walk into the kitchen with it every day. I was 28, I think. Anyway, it didn't happen because we both laughed about it, saw what was going on. She would have her own version of this. Now, Twisted Branches, the short story cycle I had published last year, Black Shark Books, that is dedicated to her for always letting me find the power of my own stories. And that in itself tells you about family relationships, your inspiration, the things that annoy you, the things that you feel absolutely understood about, and the things that you feel absolutely not understood about. They all come from a few individual stories that you lived early on. And I think we're always both running away from while desperately trying to preserve who we are. So I think it's always going to be essential, and whatever you don't have will also fascinate you. So I grew up as an only child. I have a half-sister in America, but in practical terms, I'm an only child. So siblings were fascinating, and because it was me and my mum most of the time, we lived with my grandparents when I was very little, but mainly just us. So the idea of fathers and brothers do figure a lot in my fiction, because I'm going, I wonder what that's like. And the thing that I do notice, not just about writers, about everybody, is it can be so easy to idealise, I'm an only child and I didn't have siblings, so I'm like this, and I had siblings and I'm not an only child, so I'm like that. But knowing the people I know, all of those characteristics, I've seen both sides of that. So it's never as simple as that. And then you've got some people who had to make their career decisions completely on their own because they didn't have parental support, and other people who go, well, my parents weren't there, so I didn't do this and that for a career, and other people say, well, my parents weren't there and that's why I did this and that for a career. We make the sense retrospectively, but I think we are always going to be fascinated by the stories that created us, and maybe defending them a little bit, or inquisitioning, which isn't a word.
I have a specific example of this. So Arcane at League of Legends, absolute masterpiece in storytelling and character development. I absolutely adore it. But one of the things that I really identified with in that story was the second child syndrome. So the younger sibling. So all of this is pretty much found family, but you've got Vi and you've got Jinx / Powder, as she was when she was a kid. And Vi is the older sibling, and she's very physically capable. She's very, she's a natural leader. She's absolutely trusted among people. She takes the lead because she feels this responsibility towards her little sister. But as a result, she sort of isolates the little sister. And she does everything for the little sister, but she doesn't necessarily give the little sister, who is Powder, the space to just be herself and find her own way and to find her own value. So this little sister grows up thinking that she needs to be like Vi in order to, sort of recognised and things. She's never going to be like that. She's never going to be that. And there's another relationship in this between Vanda and Silco. Silco is this sort of younger brother to Vanda. They're described as brothers at some point in the story. And Silco is the smaller one, not got the physical sort of presence of Vanda. Everyone loves Vanda because he's just this, sort of very physically dominant leader, but also, takes on this responsibility role. And you see this in older siblings. They take on a responsibility role, even though no one asks them to, because they're just older. And as a younger sibling, I saw this and I recognised myself in Powder and who she becomes as Jinx. I recognised myself in Silco. Now, Silco and Jinx are the baddies. They are the villains of the story. And for me, I identified with them the most because I was like...
You could see how they got there.
Yeah, I could see 100% how they got there. Now, that's not suggesting that I am going to blow up the world or get everyone addicted to drugs so that I can, rule an underground. But, I absolutely recognised how they got there. And I recognised their journey to becoming them in the shadow of these older siblings who had taken responsibility for them when they didn't necessarily want it. And I'm the weedy, epileptic, asthmatic child with eczema, and my sister is the, I sort of describe her as the Thor to my Loki. She's, the athletic one. She did sports. She was very physically able and capable, and she also took responsibility for me from a young age, and I just saw myself in that. And obviously, very different effects. I love my sister to pieces. She's the best person in the world, and she's just wonderful. She's my favourite. But she also did this when we were growing up. And I totally get where Silco and Jinx came from. I totally get it. Yeah.
So family relationships.
We've both picked our favourite family member and gone, here are both sides. And that will be feeding into everything, and it will be feeding into our curiosity about characters.
And every relationship has flip sides. I think with families in particular, it's just that history, isn't it?
Yeah.
You go back right to your earliest memories with your family, don't you? Yeah. And it gives us so much material, I guess, for...
Ren is the youngest sibling.
Yeah.
And he's an arse. Yeah. Now, how much of that comes from me? Because I would just walk in there. No one would listen to me because I was the youngest. And then I'd be there going, well, I told you so.
I've always wondered where Ren came from, but now we have
I'm seeing him in myself. I'm having a moment.
Well, we need to draw this discussion on relationships and fiction.
Probably a good idea now because we're getting into self-exploration, and
we are in ways
that
perhaps we shouldn't. So, Rachel, we're at that time in the episode where we ask you to give us a challenge or an exercise.
I dare you this week to have your character misinterpret another character.
Mm.
They don't have to know they're misinterpreting. It could be a gesture, it could be the words someone chooses, but they get not what was intended from it. And maybe it feels like they're being antagonised when they're not, or maybe it feels when they're being asked to do something and they're not. But let them then go off on one in whatever way they do, and let there be repercussions to that. Maybe they find out that they got the wrong end of the stick, maybe they don't. But there is such a wealth of who they are, what they believe in, what they've been conditioned by behind that. And if you feel like a little refresher, I dare you to jump into the head of one of the characters you don't normally spend time in, one who isn't your narrative viewpoint, and let yourself enjoy the scene from their point of view. Because as we've been saying over several episodes, it's just a way of freshening it up, of learning something you might not otherwise learn about that character and that world. And it's great fun to see what people can be wrong about.
Excellent. Well, listeners, I think we've demonstrated in this episode that, first of all, it's really important to have relationships, arguments, and all sorts of other things in your fiction, but also that you can have a lot of fun, whether that ends up in your stories or not. You can really have some fun with your characters.
Absolutely.
And we challenge you to go and do that.
We challenge you to have fun. That's what all this is in the end.
Exactly. As usual, Emily Inkpen, Rachel Knightley, thank you for joining us on the Writers' Gym today.
Chris Gregory, thank you for joining us and making us audible.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Writers' Gym podcast with Rachel Knightley, Emily Inkpen, and me, Chris Gregory. If you'd like to learn more about Rachel and the Writers' Gym, please go to rachelknightley.com. To find out more about Emily, please go to emilyinkpen.com. And for Chris, go to alternativestories.com. We'll print all these links and more in the show notes for this podcast. The Writers' Gym podcast is an Alternative Stories 2024 production for the Writers' Gym. Production, sound design and editing were by me, Chris Gregory.